What if you were mummified while still alive? In 1935, a team from New York's Metropolitan Museum, excavating beneath the Theban tomb of the royal architect Senmut, uncovered a woman's mummy unlike almost anything else ever pulled from Egyptian soil. Her mouth frozen wide open, teeth bared, in an expression every archaeologist who has since opened her case has described the same way: a scream. For nearly 90 years, she has been displayed under exactly that name, the Screaming Woman. And the explanations offered for her expression have ranged from poison to a violent death to the single darkest possibility Egyptologists have quietly debated for decades: that she was still alive when the rapping began. In August 2024, a team finally ran her through a CT scanner capable of testing that question directly, examining her skeleton, her tissue, and the timing of her own embalming with real forensic precision for the first time. Whatever they found, one fact about her case was never in dispute before the scan even started. Egyptian embalmers could move fast enough, the evidence would eventually show, to lock a single frozen moment onto a human face for 35 centuries. The uncomfortable question this account is built around is what else that speed might have been fast enough to do: a race against a climate. The honest answer starts with geography. Egypt's climate made speed a structural requirement of the entire embalming trade, not a stylistic choice. Summer daytime temperatures across the Nile Valley routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius, and even the milder months rarely drop far below what most of the ancient Mediterranean world would call a hot day. Decomposition in that kind of sustained heat begins within hours rather than days, a timeline modern forensic science has confirmed repeatedly in warm climate studies of soft tissue breakdown. A family that wanted a body preserved at all, let alone preserved well enough to serve as an eternal home for the soul, had no real option to wait. Egyptian religious belief held that a person's ka, a kind of life force or double, needed a recognizable physical body to return to after death in order for the deceased to continue existing in the afterlife, which is the entire theological reason mummification existed in the first place rather than simple burial. That belief created two opposing pressures at once. The religious stakes argued for extreme care, since a poorly preserved or unrecognizable body threatened the deceased's eternal existence itself. The climate argued for extreme speed, since a body left too long before treatment would decompose past the point any embalmer could preserve. Egyptian funerary practice spent 3,000 years balancing those two pressures, and the balance it settled on consistently favored speed. Embalmers' workshops, called the wabet or pure place, were typically located at the edge of the desert precisely so bodies could be moved there with minimal delay once death was declared, and the entire 70-day mummification timeline that followed was itself a response to that first, urgent handoff. Yet the record also shows the process was not always instant. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, reported a specific and unsettling exception. The bodies of beautiful women and wives of prominent men were deliberately held back from the embalmers for 3 or 4 days before being handed over. A delay, he says, existed to prevent the embalmers themselves from abusing the corpse. Whatever its real motivation, the detail confirms something important for anyone asking whether a body could reach the embalmer's table too soon. Egyptian custom already recognized that death and the embalmer's knife did not have to meet on the same afternoon. For most people, though, they very nearly did. The scale of the industry built around that urgency is easy to underestimate. Mummification in some form continued in Egypt for roughly 3,000 years, from the Old Kingdom through the Roman period, across a population that, at its pharaonic peak, likely numbered in the low millions. Even accounting for the fact that full mummification was never universal and remained disproportionately available to those who could afford it, the sheer duration of the practice means the embalmers of the Nile Valley processed an enormous number of bodies over the centuries, each one moving through the same climate-driven pressure to work fast rather than work slow. What the knife actually did. Herodotus also left the fullest surviving description of the procedure itself, and it is worth stating plainly, because the graphic nature of the process is the entire reason the central question of this account carries real weight. Embalmers first drew the brain out through the nostril using a hooked instrument, a technique modern archaeologists have confirmed, with some adjustment, through direct examination of actual mummies and their surviving tools. A stone knife then opened the left side of the abdomen, through which the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were removed. Each organ dried separately and eventually stored in canopic jars, 4 vessels whose lids were carved into the heads of the 4 sons of Horus. Each deity assigned protection over one specific organ, or, in later periods, wrapped separately and returned directly to the body cavity instead. The heart, believed to be the seat of thought and judgment in the afterlife, was deliberately left in place. Once emptied, the body was packed and covered in natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, for a stretch ancient sources give as around 40 days, drying the tissue thoroughly enough to halt decay before the final 40 days or so of wrapping, anointing, and ritual completed the standard 70-day span. Herodotus also describes 3 distinct grades of service, priced accordingly, which means the speed and thoroughness of the process a given body received depended directly on what the family could pay. The most expensive method involved the full procedure just described. A cheaper option skipped the abdominal incision entirely, instead injecting cedar oil into the body through the rectum to dissolve the internal organs before the natron treatment, a method that left the viscera to be drained out later rather than physically removed. The cheapest option of all amounted to little more than a thorough natron packing with minimal other intervention. Whichever tier a family chose, the underlying urgency imposed by the climate did not change. A cut-rate embalming still had to begin quickly, since decay does not wait for a family to finish negotiating a price. There is no step in that sequence a living person could survive. Brain removal alone would be fatal within moments. This is precisely why the question this account is built around is not, could someone have woken up partway through, the way premature burial stories from later centuries typically go. It is narrower and, if anything, darker. Could the process have begun on someone who was not yet dead when the hook went in? A system with no checkpoint. No surviving Egyptian medical or religious text describes a formal procedure for confirming death before a body was accepted at the Wabet. This absence is itself informative rather than simply a gap in the record, since Egyptian scribes documented an enormous range of ritual and practical detail about death, from the specific prayers recited over each organ to the wages paid to different grades of embalmer, and a genuinely universal safeguard against mistaken death would likely have left some trace if one had existed. What the sources do show is a system built for speed and family attestation rather than clinical verification. A body was declared dead by the people around it, at home, in a climate that punished delay, and then moved quickly toward a process with no reversible early stages. This gap is genuinely surprising, given how sophisticated Egyptian medicine was in nearly every other respect. Surviving medical papyri, including the Edwin Smith papyrus, describe surgical case studies with a clinical precision that would not look of place in a modern textbook, distinguishing wounds a physician could treat from those judged untreatable, with language that reads like an early triage system. Egyptian physicians could assess a pulse, recognize the significance of breathing, and had a working, if incomplete, understanding of the heart's role in circulating something through the body. None of that clinical vocabulary appears to have been formally applied at the one moment where its absence carried the highest possible stakes: the handoff between a family's declaration of death and an embalmer's first cut. Egyptian embalmers themselves held an unusual, almost contradictory social position that may partly explain the silence. They performed work essential to the culture's entire religious framework, yet handling a corpse also carried a degree of ritual impurity, and embalmers, as a professional class, operated somewhat apart from mainstream society. Their techniques passed down within the trade rather than folded into the broader medical literature. Scribes were otherwise so willing to preserve a death confirmation protocol, if one had existed, might easily have lived inside that same insular professional culture and simply never made it into the wider written record at all. One honest possibility among several for why the silence exists. The silence is especially striking set against what Egyptian religious texts do describe in exhausting detail. The Book of the Dead spends chapter after chapter on the weighing of the heart. The moment an already dead soul stood before Osiris and 42 assessor gods to have that heart balanced against the feather of Ma'at. A judgment scene painted on tomb walls and copied onto papyrus for anyone who could afford the service. Scribes documented that afterlife procedure down to the specific denials the deceased was expected to recite. No comparable text describes the much earlier, much more practical judgment of whether the person lying in front of the family that morning was actually dead at all. Compare that to the response other ancient Mediterranean societies eventually developed to the exact same anxiety. Ancient Greek tradition held that the philosopher Empedocles, around the 5th century BCE, revived a woman already prepared for burial, an event later writers credited with prompting Greek communities to require a waiting period of 6 or 7 days before interment, specifically to guard against exactly this mistake. Centuries later, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded the case of a consul named Acilius, who reportedly woke and cried out as his own funeral pyre had already been lit beneath him. Egypt, as far as the surviving textual record shows, never generated an equivalent institutional response, despite running the most aggressive, most irreversible, and fastest-moving mortuary industry in the ancient Mediterranean world. The contrast is not simply a matter of Greece and Rome being more medically advanced. Both cultures cremated or buried their dead using methods that left considerably more time between apparent death and an irreversible act than Egyptian embalming ever allowed. A body on a funeral pyre could, at least in principle, still be pulled free before the flames did fatal damage, and Pliny's account of Acilius describes exactly that kind of last-second rescue. Once an Egyptian embalmer's hook had entered the skull, no equivalent moment of intervention existed at all. Conditions that could fool the living. None of this requires imagining exotic medical scenarios. Catalepsy, a real and documented condition in which a person's muscles lock into rigid stillness for anywhere from minutes to days, produces a body that can appear breathless and unresponsive to anyone without modern diagnostic tools. Deep coma, certain poisonings, severe blood loss, and even profound hypothermia can slow a pulse and breathing rate to the point that touch alone, in a hot, dim mud brick house with no stethoscope and no mirror held to the lips as a formal test, would not reliably distinguish the condition from death. Ancient Egyptian medicine, sophisticated as it was in treating wounds and diagnosing many internal complaints, had no framework equivalent to modern brain death criteria, and had every practical incentive, given the climate, to treat an unresponsive body as a body to be moved rather than a patient to be monitored. Snakebite, a genuine hazard across the Nile Valley, adds another specific candidate to this list. Certain neurotoxic venoms can produce a state of profound paralysis, suppressed breathing, and an almost undetectable pulse while the victim remains conscious internally. A combination now well documented in modern toxicology, and one that, without ventilator support, can look indistinguishable from death to an untrained observer for a period of hours. This is the structural argument at the center of the entire question. It is not that Egyptian embalmers were careless, it is that the entire system, climate-driven speed, family-based death declaration, and a total absence of any known waiting protocol, created exactly the conditions under which a rare mistake becomes statistically difficult to rule out over a tradition that ran for 3,000 years and processed, conservatively, millions of bodies. Modern medicine still treats this general problem as a live concern, even with tools ancient Egypt never had. Formal brain death criteria were not standardized anywhere in the world until the second half of the 20th century, and hospitals today rely on a specific combination of neurological tests, imaging, and observation windows precisely because a single check, a pulse, a breath, a reflex, can be misleading in isolation. If a fully equipped modern hospital still requires layered verification to avoid a wrongful declaration of death, a household in Bronze Age Egypt relying on touch, sight, and a few hours of grief-stricken observation before sending a body to the Wabet was working with dramatically less margin for error. A second screaming face. The structural argument at the center of this account does not have to stay abstract, because Egypt's mummy record already includes another documented case of an open-mouthed, contorted face, and this one comes with a name attached. A mummy discovered in the same general excavation context, nicknamed the Unknown Man E, is now widely believed, based on separate DNA and historical evidence, to be Prince Pentawere, condemned to death for his role in the assassination of Ramesses III around 1155 BCE. His body was wrapped in an unclean goatskin rather than properly embalmed, a detail scholars read as a mark of disgrace rather than any implication about his state of consciousness during the process. His case, unlike the one this account opened with, comes with a historical record that already explains his violent end independently of his facial expression. And researchers examining his remains have proposed his contorted features and unusual embalming likely reflect the manner of his execution and the deliberate punishment embedded in how his body was treated afterward, rather than any question about his awareness during mummification itself. But the recurrence of open-mouthed mummies across multiple excavations has kept the underlying question alive in Egyptological literature for nearly a century, long before any single case could be resolved with a CT scanner. Museums that once displayed these bodies under sensational names, in recent decades, increasingly pairing them with exactly this kind of hedged scientific explanation, since the honest answer to what any single expression means turns out to require more evidence than a skull alone can supply. A face that might be a clue and might be nothing. Which brings the account back to the case it opened with, the screaming woman herself, and to what her 2024 CT scan actually found. Because unlike Pentawere, she is the closest thing the archaeological record offers to physical evidence bearing directly on the question, rather than an already explained execution. The mummy had been part of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo's collection since that original 1935 expedition, but she went unstudied in any real scientific depth for decades. One of thousands of mummies in Egyptian collections still awaiting the kind of detailed imaging her case eventually received. Researchers using computed tomography estimated she died in her late 40s, found evidence of mild arthritis, and could identify no fatal wound, poison residue, or obvious cause of death. Her jaw remained open, her mummification otherwise intact and carefully executed. Resins used in her wrapping identified as relatively costly imports rather than cut-rate materials. And her nails coated in henna. All details the study's authors used to argue she was a woman of real social standing rather than an anonymous burial of convenience. That combination matters since a family able to afford imported embalming resins and cosmetic care was also, presumably, a family with the resources to notice a mistake and intervene before it became irreversible. At least in theory, it also means her case cannot be dismissed as a rushed, low-budget burial where corners were cut and warning signs plausibly missed. Whatever happened to her happened inside a household that had both the means and, presumably, the motivation to get her death right. The leading explanation offered by the study's authors is cadaveric spasm, a genuine and medically recognized phenomenon in which certain muscles remain contracted at death rather than relaxing the way most of the body does. Typically associated with sudden, high-stress deaths, and one that would only remain visible on a mummy if embalming began before that spasm had time to release on its own. That finding does not prove she was ever alive on the embalmer's table. It proves the opposite of what her nickname implies about violence, while simultaneously proving something the researchers themselves emphasized. Whatever killed her, her body reached the Wabbit fast enough and was processed fast enough to lock a moment of dying directly onto her skeleton for 35 centuries. The same speed that makes her face a genuine forensic clue is the speed this entire account has been describing as a structural risk. She is evidence that the system moved quickly. She is not, and should not be presented as, evidence that it moved too quickly in her specific case. Egyptologists studying cases like hers and Pentawer's generally agree on the mechanics, even when they disagree on individual interpretation. An open mouth on a mummy usually reflects a genuine cadaveric spasm, a jaw left unbound before rigor mortis set in, or simple gas buildup, shifting the jaw's position during the natron drying stage. Particularly on the cheaper tiers of service Herodotus described, where a less careful embalmer might have skipped the customary chin support entirely. Each of those explanations is mundane, technical, and fully consistent with an already dead body. Any one of them is more probable, case by case, than a scenario requiring the person to have still been breathing when the wrapping began. And the researchers who study these mummies are generally careful to say so. That is precisely why the more interesting question was never any single face. It is what a system capable of producing this many ambiguous cases across this many centuries says about the odds across all of them combined, the delay that only some bodies received. Herodotus's detail about wealthy or beautiful women being held back for 3 or 4 days deserves a second look in this context, because it demonstrates that Egyptian society was capable of building deliberate delay into the mortuary process when it had a reason to. The stated reason, preventing embalmers from violating a corpse, had nothing to do with confirming death, but the practical side effect would have been real regardless of the intention behind it. A body held in a household for 3 or 4 days before reaching the wab, but had that much more time for any lingering, undetected sign of life to either resolve into unmistakable death or, in an exceptionally rare case, to reveal itself before the knife was ever raised. 3 or 4 days also happens to be close to the same waiting period Greek communities would later formalize into law for the opposite explicit reason, which suggests the delay, however it originated, happened to land in roughly the same window later societies deliberately chose once they were reasoning about the problem directly. That protective margin, incidental as it may have been, appears to have applied only to a narrow, privileged subset of the dead. Most Egyptians, including the vast peasant majority whose burials rarely survive in the archaeological record at all, had no equivalent grace period, moving from household to workshop on whatever timeline the heat and their families' resources allowed. This creates an uncomfortable asymmetry worth stating directly. If any protective margin against the mistake this account has been describing existed at all, even by accident, it existed almost exclusively for the wealthy and the well-connected, the same demographic whose mummies are disproportionately the ones that survive for modern archaeologists to study in the first place. The peasant majority, embalmed quickly and cheaply if embalmed at all, left behind a far thinner physical record, which means the population statistically most exposed to a fast, unverified death declaration is also the population science has the least direct evidence about. Whatever happened to the poorest, fastest processed bodies in ancient Egypt happened almost entirely outside the historical record. It simply did not survive to be studied. The mummy collections modern museums draw on to answer questions like this one are themselves a product of that same imbalance. Caches like the one at Deir el-Bahari and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings preserved royal and elite bodies precisely because they were sealed in dry rock-cut chambers, wrapped with costly resins and revisited by priests across generations. The graves of ordinary farmers and laborers, dug into damp riverside soil or reused many times over, rarely kept soft tissue intact long enough for a modern CT scanner to have anything left to examine. Every statistic in this account about how the system worked is therefore built, by necessity, on the bodies of the people least representative of how most Egyptians actually died. Legacy. This is, honestly, the closest thing to an answer 3,000 years of silence will ever allow. Modern Egyptology has no confirmed case of a mummy embalmed while still alive, and this account has not claimed one exists. What it has documented instead is a system, sustained across roughly 3,000 years of continuous practice, that combined maximum urgency, minimal formal verification, and a process with no survivable early step, in a way that later Mediterranean cultures explicitly built legal and ritual safeguards to avoid. Researchers continue to run new CT scans, isotope analyses, and paleo-radiological studies on royal and non-royal mummies alike. And each new scan carries at least the theoretical possibility of finding evidence, a bone marker, a spasm pattern, a positioning detail that would finally answer the question this account can only leave open. The screaming woman herself was scanned and studied for the better part of a century before a 2024 imaging team finally had the technology to offer a specific, testable explanation for her expression. Rather than a guess, in the same institutions running her case are actively re-examining older mummy collections with equipment that did not exist even a decade ago. The screaming woman's open mouth is very likely nothing more than a fast burial catching a natural muscular reflex, exactly as her 2024 study concluded. But she was found that way precisely because Egyptian embalmers moved quickly enough to catch death itself in the act. And a civilization willing to work that fast for 3,000 years without ever writing down how it checked first leaves behind a question its own silence never quite closes. Millions of bodies passed through that system across 3 millennia. It would take only one mistake, unrecorded and indistinguishable from an ordinary burial to everyone involved, for the answer to this account's central question to already be sitting, unread, inside a museum collection somewhere in the world. Thousands of mummies in institutional storage worldwide have never received the kind of imaging that finally gave the screaming woman her explanation, waiting in climate-controlled rooms for the same combination of funding, technology, and scholarly attention that took her from an unsettling curiosity to an actual, testable finding. Somewhere in that backlog, the next answer, or the next open question, is almost certainly still waiting too,